Hello again. I am back to read more of your reading packet and go over answers. I'll try to get a lot more done with you today so that we can start working on the math. I know that next week is spring break, so you don't want to have to be working on these. Hopefully you are further than what I am in this because you've been working on it every day, or at least close to that. But we'll try to get through these and the math before spring break, so you guys don't have to worry about it over your week at home. So we are starting on page 68. We're continuing with A Man on the Moon, and I did not read this portion, I don't believe yet. So what I'm going to do is read this, and then we'll go over the questions, okay? So we're starting at the top, spying eyes in the sky. And remember, we are talking about the space race. So the Soviet Union and the United States basically fighting to see who could gain the most access and the most fame by putting a man in space and a man on the moon. Okay. While the United States was working on a manned lunar mission, events on the ground were getting tense. Tense means like it felt very like an argument could happen at any time. The United States and the Soviet Union were getting into conflicts as the Soviets helped communism to spread. Okay. Communism, that word is highlighted also, so let's just talk about that real quick. Communism is a form of government that is basically completely controlled by the government. So, more or less, everyone is equal. The government will basically allot an amount of money that people should live off of. They assign jobs to people. They don't have many options in their economics. So everybody is basically the same. There is technically not supposed to be a upper class or a middle class or a lower class. Everybody is equal. American airmen spotted Soviet missile sites being built in Cuba. With Cuba only a short distance from Florida, missiles fired from these sites could easily strike the United States. Meanwhile, the Americans had a missile base in Turkey near the Soviet border. For 2 weeks, the Cuban Missile Crisis threatened the world with nuclear war. Eventually, both countries stepped back from the brink. So the brink would be like the edge of that war happening. Still, there was a lot of mistrust. Space missions gave both countries another way to spy on each other from the air. Both countries soon developed spy satellites that would allow them to photograph and monitor each other from space. Reaching the moon. Although the Soviets dominated early in the space race, things were about to change. The Americans did not seem to be making progress, but they were. Each NASA mission built on the previous one. The Soviets said publicly that they were not trying to reach the moon, but they worked covertly on that project as well. Their efforts were less successful, though. As it turns out, the Soviets were using many smaller engines while the Americans were using a few larger ones. In the end, the Soviets never did put a man on the moon. Lunar landing. Apollo 11, the American mission that would land the first men on the moon, was made up of several parts. The Saturn V rocket would power it into space. The Columbia command module would take the astronauts into lunar orbit. The Eagle lunar module would be the part that landed on the moon's surface. Next page. The voyage began on July 16, 1969. aboard Apollo 11 were Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Edwin Buzz Aldrin Jr. Everything went as planned. After reaching lunar orbit, Armstrong and Aldrin boarded the Eagle and landed it on the moon on July 19th, with Armstrong famously reporting, "The Eagle has landed." As Armstrong descended the ladder to become the first person to set foot on the moon, he said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Okay, so there's that portion of it. Let's go back to the previous page and answer A and B on here. A asks, how did political tension on the ground influence the space race? Underline the answer in the text. Okay, so the political tension, like we talked about, was because of opposing viewpoints on what kind of government should be used around the world. So, underline the sentence in paragraph 21. So the first one on that page. It says, the United States and the Soviet Union were getting into conflicts as the Soviets helped communism to spread. And so that's the answer as to why or where the political tension was coming from. And it influenced the space race because they were arguing about these different types of governments, and if one of the countries won the space race, it would kind of show the other country that not only are they right about government, but they're also better at they won the space race. They're ahead. They are better in a lot more ways. So, again, underline 21. I don't know if that's backwards for you guys or not. It's backwards to me, but hopefully it's not backwards to you. Part B. Why were the Soviets being secretive about their efforts to send a man to the moon? Put an asterisk at the beginning of the paragraph that helps answer this question. And then discuss with a partner what you can infer about the Soviet failure to reach the moon. Alright, so the first part. Let's break this down. Why were the Soviets being secretive about their efforts to send a man to the moon? Well, the countries didn't trust each other. So, they were both using satellites and their spy satellites to photograph and monitor what each other were doing. So they didn't want the United States to know what they were doing, because essentially they were also spying on the United States to see what they were doing. So put an asterisk at the beginning of the paragraph that helps answer this question. So I put a star and highlighted that paragraph. It is paragraph 22. Okay. It says, still there was a lot of mistrust. Space missions gave both countries another way to spy on each other from the air. Both countries soon developed the spy satellites that would allow them to photograph and monitor each other from outer space. All right. And the last part. So we did the first part, the second part. Discuss with a partner what you can infer about the Soviet failure to reach the moon. So this is something that you can just think about. You don't have to write it down. If you would like to tell me something you infer, I would love to hear it. You guys can call me or post your own video, or if you want to do a Google Meets, I would love to do that and see you guys. Just let me know. We can all discuss some of this stuff together if you want. I'm going to keep going with the other questions, though, so we can get through a little bit more of this. And maybe we can get together and discuss those as a group. All right, let's go to the comprehension check. And in just a second, I will show you how well my daughter did on it. She worked really hard. on this work. She was very proud of herself. She said she was writing her name. It's close, really close. All right, question 1. Good morning.
Good morning, Mom.
America had fallen behind the Soviet Union because A, the Soviets put a man in space first. B, the Soviets reached the moon with a spacecraft first. C, the Soviets launched the first satellite. Or D, all of the above. So America had fallen behind the Soviet Union because, okay, did the Soviets put a man in space first? They did. They actually put a man in space first, and we know that from, let's see, I think it was over here. Yes. In paragraph 15 on page 66, the Russians then stunned the world by sending the first human into space. Okay, so that one's true. So let's not jump right into selecting that as the answer, but let's see if B is a possibility. The Soviets reached the moon with a spacecraft first. Let's go back and find out if that is true. Right? Let me find where that one is. Okay, yeah. So paragraph 13. The moon was the next frontier. The Russians again were leading the way. They crash-landed the spacecraft Luna 2 on the surface of the moon in 1959. So that was the first time that anybody had sent something to the moon. So that one is correct. And then the Soviets launched the first satellite. And that one's true too. So our answer would be D, all of the above. Okay, question 2. What issue about putting an American on the moon worried President Kennedy? A, America could not afford the cost. B, the Soviets were too far ahead. C, putting people on the moon was technologically impossible. Or D, Americans would not pull together. All right, so in this one, we actually talked about this in the last video. There was a whole section, paragraph 18, in Kennedy's speech. It was about how Kennedy recognized that the Soviets were pretty far ahead of the U.S., that they had, that so far they were leading the way. So the issue that was worrying President Kennedy was B, the Soviets were too far ahead. And it talked about that a lot throughout the passages, so the different ways that the Soviets were winning the space race. And that issue is what most worried President Kennedy. Okay. Number 3. Which of the following would be a primary source about the first moon landing? So again, in the other video we talked about primary sources being from a resource that was there when it happened. It's a speech. It is any account firsthand from somebody. So I couldn't create a primary source about World War II because I wasn't there. But if I had fought in World War II and I had wrote an account of something I had gone through, that would be a primary source. So if we look at these options, a textbook chapter about rocket development. Okay, well, a textbook chapter tells you about rocket development. It's not a source about the first moon landing, and it also isn't an account from somebody who was there developing rockets, so can't be A. B, a film clip of Armstrong and Aldrin landing on the moon. Okay, could we use that as a primary source? Yeah, Yeah, that can definitely be considered a primary source about the first moon landing, because not only is it the people who are there, it is the actual clip of them landing on the moon. So it is firsthand documentation of that event. Okay, so the answer for 3 would be B. Number 4, what does covertly in paragraph 24 mean? Secretly, carefully, quickly, seriously. All right, so let's use our context clues. We'll go look at the word covertly and the sentence around it. So again, it is in paragraph 24. The Soviets said publicly that they were not trying to reach the moon, but they worked covertly on that project as well. Okay, so they said publicly that they weren't trying to reach the moon, but they worked covertly. So what could covertly mean? One way you guys could do this, and if you have questions like this in the future, you can try this strategy too. Go plug in the words for covertly. Go plug in the options and see if they work. So the first one is secretly. Does the word secretly work in that sentence and make sense? It has to make sense for it to be correct. So the Soviets said publicly that they were not trying to reach the moon, but they worked secretly on that project as well. Okay. Is that something that the Soviets were doing? Were they working secretly on the project and not telling people? Yes. So we have the answer right there. It's A, secretively, but you can still go through and see if like carefully, quickly, and seriously would work. But the best option based on what we know, so what we've inferred from the text and the context clues in the paragraph and around the word secretly, is the best option and is another word for covertly. All right, number 5. How has drawing inferences helped you understand the text? Specifically, how do you better understand the connection between the space race and politics? Confer with a partner and use evidence from the text to support your answer. All right, so this one is asking what you think. How has it helped you understand the text? And remember, drawing inferences is using what you have, using what you're given, and making educated guesses on stuff that isn't specifically told in the passage. So the second question, specifically, how do you better understand the connection between the space race and politics? For me personally, I can see that the space race and politics were very closely connected, because the disagreements over the types of government, so communism versus capitalism, those were a big deal. And so the space race just kind of fueled all of that tension. And so there was tension between the space race, and then tension between governments and types of governments, what should be used. You guys can put other options there. So I want you to write down how drawing inferences helps you understand the text. How did things like the United States launching 2 monkeys into space and recovering them in a splash landing, how could that help you infer what is going to happen in the future? So that is for you to write and go through. And if you need to pause it and you want to do that now, you can. If not, we are going to go to the next page, and I'm going to start reading Getting Home from the Moon. Paragraph 27. The Apollo 11 mission was not complete until the astronauts returned safely home. After studying and taking samples on the moon's surface, Armstrong and Aldrin got back into the Eagle and launched it into the lunar sky. Everything would have to function properly, or they would be stranded on the moon with no way home. Meanwhile, Collins had been orbiting in the Columbia ever since Armstrong and Aldrin had left the Eagle. The plan was for the Eagle and the Columbia to dock in space. The measurements and timing had to be exact. Millions of people watched on television and cheered as Armstrong and Aldrin joined Collins. They had done it. The astronauts separated the two crafts and let the Eagle drift away into space. The final rocket had just enough thrust to get the Columbia out from the moon's orbit. The astronauts splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24th. The mission was accomplished and President Kennedy's challenge had been answered. Other Apollo missions. In all, 6 Apollo missions, Apollo 11, 12, and 14 through 17, sent people safely to the moon, giving humanity a wealth of scientific data and lunar samples. Experiments included the study of soil, meteoroids, heat flow, magnetic fields, solar wind, and more. Apollo 13 captured photos but did not land on the moon due to a malfunction. An explosion occurred in space. Pilot John L. Swigert Jr. calmly reported to Mission Control, "Houston, we've had a problem." The whole world held its breath until the astronauts made it home back after overcoming mechanical difficulties and dwindling supplies. From competition to cooperation. After years of competition, the Soviet Union and America planned a joint mission. It was a symbol of hope and goodwill for people at a time when wars were being fought over communism and superpowers were stockpiling nuclear weapons. Next page. On January 17, 1975, the Apollo and Soyuz crafts docked into space. The hatch opened and Apollo commander Thomas P. Stafford and Soyuz commander Alexei A. Leonov shook hands. People back on Earth dared to hope for peace. Alright, so we finished that one. Let's go back and do these questions. I have actually not done these, so we're going to be doing them together. For real together. Okay, so A asks, why was docking the two crafts in space hard to do? In paragraph 28, put an asterisk next to the stated reason. Alright, let's read paragraph 28 again. Meanwhile, Collins had been orbiting in the Columbia ever since Armstrong and Aldrin had left in the Eagle. The plan was for the Eagle and the Columbia to dock in space. Okay, so we're looking for why it's hard to do. The measurements and timing had to be exact. Millions of people watched on television and cheered as Armstrong and Aldrin joined Collins. They had done it. The astronauts separated the two crafts and let the Eagle drift away into space. So why was it hard to do? The measurements and timing had to be exact. Can you imagine how difficult that would be? So I'm not going to put an asterisk. I'm just going to highlight it. You guys can underline it. The measurements and timing had to be exact. Paragraph 28. Paragraph 29. Question B. Why did the astronauts have to leave the Eagle behind? Underline the clue that helps you infer the answer. Why was this an important moment in the space race? Okay, give me 1 second. Sorry, I have